Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geoff Huston. I work with APNIC. I'm their chief scientist, which means I sit around and think a lot. But it's truly a pleasure to be here this afternoon again in Hong Kong, and my thanks to the Hong Kong Internet Society for inviting me here. So I'd like to share with you some thoughts and some observations about IPv6 and look at what's happened in the last year. Because something that we never thought would happen, happened. We were never meant to give away the last v4 address. You guys were meant to have done v6 years ago. So we're in a situation that we never thought would have happened. But that's not the first time. I've been working in this industry now for about the last 30 years and working in IP for most of it. But this industry is much older than me. It dates back to the telephone, which was first introduced to the world in 1876 at the International Exposition in Philadelphia. In fact, it even goes back to the 1830s and the first international telegraph services. So we have a very, very long history in the telecommunications world. And we're a very, very big industry. But that doesn't mean we get things right. Our mistakes are hideously big. Anyone remember ATM? Some of you do. Terrible mistake. How about ISDN? Did that happen here? It happened in my country. Terrible mistake. We made some really, really lousy choices when we did technology. And some of the things that are most successful were complete surprises. You were never meant to use SMS. That wasn't what it was intended for. And IP was never meant to happen. Both of these were complete surprises. So this industry, sometimes things just happen by mistake. Sometimes they're not planned. The internet was one of those. It's a runaway success. We'd never dreamt that this was going to happen. Right up until the early 1990s, we were saying to ourselves, it's just an experiment. It's just an experiment. Something else will happen. But it didn't. The internet happened. And did it happen? We have altered most of the world. Almost all of you in your pocket now carry your little version of the internet. I know I do. All of us now see the internet as something that happens as part of our lives, all of us on this planet. But the original address space we had only had 32 bits. We've run out. Now, if anyone thinks that's news, where have you been the last few years? Because we all knew this was going to happen. This is not a surprise. Indeed, if I go and look back through the archives, 22 years ago, this was forecast. This is what we were using. That was the 1990s version of PowerPoint, handwritten slides. And this is the original slides that came from a guy by the name of Frank Zielinski that said, we had a problem. And the problem was that we were going to run out of addresses by the middle of the 1990s. But we didn't. We invented this very cute hack because we're engineers and we could. And we changed the way the addressing plant works in IP. We removed the old classful structure and replaced it with classless routing. And all of a sudden, the growth curves changed. We were looking at disaster, and in the middle of the 90s, when we deployed this slightly altered version of v4, all of a sudden the growth curves changed. CIDR worked for us. Pat on the back, did well. At the same time, though, we knew that that was only a stopgap. So back in 1992, 20 years ago, we started working on what was now going to become IPv6. But we're technicians, not business people. So what we thought was, if we invent a really good protocol, all the business people will just figure it out as to how to deploy it later. It's not our problem. So we left that task of actually figuring out how to move from one protocol to the other to a bit later. And then we went back to sleep because it wasn't an urgent problem because we'd sort of solved the urgency. And what happened was amazing. We had an internet boom in 2000 and a bust. And then we all started to deploy broadband all over the planet. Here in Hong Kong, almost every basement now has fibre. Multi-tenement apartments are now part and parcel. The internet is everywhere. And in the last few years, mobiles and mobile IP have moved in. We now sell 300 million of these mobile devices every year, and it's growing rapidly. We're building an enormous number of networks. Sadly, almost all of them in v4. And all of a sudden, those 4 billion addresses started to look surprisingly small because we ran out. And in April of last year, APNIC handed out its last address block. We have no more. Europe is going to run out as well. Best forecast I can give you, about the 12th of August, in a couple of months' time. America, probably about the middle of next year. That's it. No more. That was never meant to happen. That was the biggest oops we could have done, because all of a sudden we're trying to sort of deploy v6, but we've got no more v4 to help us. That's a problem. And by the look of it, the problem's only going to get worse. The red line there shows you the level of annual demand for addresses, which keeps on growing steadily and slowly, up and up and up. But the blue line shows the declining stocks around the planet. We're running out. And that yellow line is demand, unmet demand. By 2014, in just 2 years' time, we'll be about 1 billion addresses short. That big, that much of a problem. All of a sudden, we really have a massive issue on our hands. And now, this whole transition to v6 is the most important topic we can think of in the internet today. It is critical. So, how do we build the next 300 million new devices into the internet without having any more addresses? We can't even make the transition to v6 without using addresses in v4. All of a sudden, the problem is really big. So we've now gone to a new phase, and a frightening phase. If you want addresses right now for your next great plan, if you're an ISP in Hong Kong, where are you going to get them from? Don't look at me. APNIC doesn't have any. You're going to have to go to the markets. You're going to have to buy them, and they're not going to be cheap. We don't know how much it's going to cost, but we have grave concerns. Currently, we are seeing the early market come in, and it's around $11 an address. Our fear is that it could go as high as over $1,000 an address. At that price, the internet itself starts to crack and break up under the stress. That's just too much. If the price gets too low, we've got a problem as well, oddly enough. And if we have high volatility, the price moves up and down, a bit like the share market, that's not a good idea either. This market looks frightening for everybody. But that's where we are. And if you want addresses today, that's what you're going to have to do. We don't know how much you're going to have to pay, but we suspect there are some real issues here. For anybody in this business, consumers, government regulators, ISPs, content providers, for everybody, this is a problem. This is unsustainable. And the other issue is that we'd have liked to have seen more v6 out there, but we haven't. Google have been running dual stack for some time, many years, and they've been plotting the amount of folk who visit their site using v6 because they have a choice. And this is one of those classic internet curves that goes up and to the right. Yep, numbers increase every year. But the scale, that's not tens of percents. That's not even 1%. Right now, the number of folk who are accessing Google on v6 is just 0.6%, 6 in 1,000. That's not encouraging. That's not happening. At APNIC, we've done a similar piece of work. We measure approximately 700,000 users every day at random. We're using Google Ads and Flash so that whenever you watch YouTube, you may, with luck, be helping us measure V6. And because we have enough folk, we can actually plot this out country by country. The green is looking good, the yellow is so-so, the red, we can't see it. America, doing well. China, similarly. Australia and parts of Europe, yeah, and so on. Here's a plot of the United States, and the vertical graph is now percents. In the US, over the last few months, we've been seeing the level of V6 rise slowly and inexorably upwards. Oddly enough, in the last week, we saw a bit of a massive uptick. I believe Comcast have been turning on V6 very quickly. And what you're seeing is a lot of broadband deployment. So in the US, around about 0.6% moving upwards. France. In France, the second largest provider there, a company called Free, and no, it's not free, it's just a good name, has been doing V6 for many years. And the result of that is extraordinary, because in France, between 3 and 4% of French users on the internet use V6 every day. Amazing success story. China, a bit hard in China because Google isn't the most popular of search engines, but there's still enough to measure. And though we see some variation, we are seeing significant numbers in China and an uptake in recent days of getting up over 1%. The Chinese are certainly moving and moving very, very quickly. So, you ask, what about Hong Kong? Good question. I have some data. It's not very good data. In fact, it's actually pretty poor data. Not poor because of the poor data, but poor because there's not a lot of V6 out there. Up until last week or so, we were seeing 1 in 1,000 users in Hong Kong accessing V6. Not 6, not 10, just 1 in 1,000. And although there's been a recent jump there very, very lately, probably as part of this V6 launch, the numbers are still not the same as the rest of the world. There's certainly more to do here, I believe, from these numbers. But it's not as bad as you think. It's not as bad as you think. There's an awful lot of V6 around. Every major intercontinental or even international provider handles V6 right now. So if you start to move your packets around the world, they can go in V6. Interestingly, as long as you're not running Windows XP, which by the way you shouldn't anyway because it's virus-ridden, upgrade. But once you upgrade, you get another thing as well. You get V6. Because every recent version of Windows, Windows Vista, Windows 7, every version of the Mac operating system, even every version of iOS and every Android has V6 in it and turned on. And that's about half of the internet. The other half runs XP, turn it off. But half of the internet has V6. So there are these two amazing towers of achievement. We've literally enabled every device on the planet with V6. And we've got most of the transit networks with V6. So what's the problem? The problem is that last mile, your access provider, getting the bits from your home or your workplace across into the network. And that's where we're failing. 0.5% of the internet actually uses V6, and the problem is in that last mile. So that last mile infrastructure is extremely challenging for us as an industry. Why? Well, that's the place that commodity economics is really working hard. That's the place where actually the money is not prevalent. People pay $24 for a Facebook share. Facebook's worth billions. Apple is worth 600 billion. Google is worth billions. But what about your access provider, the person who's your ISP? How much are they worth? Nowhere near the same. It's a different kind of business, and it's a business that's tough. It's tough because the margins are low and the costs are high. And all of a sudden to say to those businesses, oh, you've got to spend money doing V6 as well. And by the way, your customers aren't going to pay you 1 cent more. This is money you're just going to have to lay down and invest without the rate of returns that you're used to. That's not a proposition that looks attractive. That's terrible. And that's why, for the best of reasons, this has been a problem. Why didn't we do it earlier? Because if we'd done this 10 years ago, it would have been a much easier problem. Why didn't we? Well, it's all about economics. It's all about the fact that this isn't really a technical problem. This is actually a business problem. And it's a problem about the deregulated business and the way it operates. Because if you actually look at the ISP, it isn't doing anything because its own supply channels were also V4 only. How many folk did DSL modems that supported V6? Almost none. All of a sudden they're saying their supply chains don't work either. So the economics of the situation were actually causing us to get wedged into V4. Even though it should have been done earlier, even though all the signals said do it, the money wasn't there. And that V6 represented an investment that simply didn't work. So now we are in a situation that we never planned for. Now we're in a situation where neither the technologists or the business folk or the regulators ever thought we had to cope with. Because the kinds of questions that you will expect now are manifest. They're all over the place. Should I do V6? When? Today? Tomorrow? How much is it going to cost? Where am I going to get the money from? Will customers pay me any more? Maybe I should wait, but you haven't got any addresses. Oh, maybe I should buy a carrier-grade NAT instead. Or maybe you should. How big? I don't know. How long will it last? I don't know. What's your business plan? I don't know. Neither do you. We're in a state now where there's massive uncertainty across the entire industry because none of us are sure where this is heading. But I think we have a choice. You and I have a choice here. Because one way we can actually start to constrict the internet, to actually start deploying middleware, to put in carrier-grade NATs, to assume that the world is the web and the web is the world and that's all there is. You can do that, but I don't think it's a nice way of doing this. The alternative is you can actually seriously consider doing V6. Choose very carefully. Choose extremely carefully. Tomorrow's world is very, very different. If you were listening to the launch of the new iPad in March of this year, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, said something that I think is actually a mantra for this decade. We're living in a post-PC world. The PC, the personal computer that morphed into the laptop, is now over. It's now no longer the mainstream of this industry. This industry is now getting smaller, more powerful, and in your pocket. Computing is something you carry with you everywhere. The internet is with you everywhere. It's part of your trip on the train to work. It's part of going out and having a coffee. It's part of your work. It's part of your home. It's part of your lifestyle. It's part of looking what the weather will be or the transit of Venus. It all happens here. Everything. Communication, content, storage, all of that needs to be abundant. All of that needs to be available everywhere. If you think you can squeeze that into HTTP and only HTTP, good luck. I don't think you can. Tomorrow's network will be much richer than today's if we get this right. But it's not clear that we're going to make the right choice. It's not clear because it's hard to say who's in control. The industry is actually deregulated. The telephone companies aren't in control. Google isn't in control, despite appearances. Facebook isn't in control. Nobody is in control. The internet is actually a whole set of market forces. It's consumers and suppliers having a fine old time competing with each other. Which path we take is actually a path dictated by these market conditions. So if I want V6, if I really want and treasure a network that's truly open, a network that scales so that just around me is a plethora of devices, not just my laptop, because that's old stuff. It's my iPhone, it's my Kindle, it's even these remote controls. It might even be my passport with its RFID chip in it. If I want that, then how do I make it happen? How do I help us along that path? How do we manage this transition to ensure that collectively we all focus on V6? Because if we get distracted by trying to build a better NAT, by trying to push everything over HTTP, by trying to populate a network with middleware, that all of a sudden an open and permissionless network becomes the closed and restricted network we were used to with telephony. How do we stop that? How do we make sure we actually continue down the path of openness? That's a really hard question. It's a really, really hard question. And the data so far on uptake suggests we're not doing very well. Remember, 1 in 1,000 users in Hong Kong has V6 right now. We're not doing terribly well, are we? So how do we make the world better? How are we going to help? Or at least how are we going to avoid making it any worse if we can't make it any better? It's a really hard question. And I hope some of you have the answer, because I don't. Because this is a really hard question. It's a hard question for regulators, it's a hard question for ISPs, it's actually a hard question for everybody. So I'm not sure what's going to work. So instead, what I'd like to have, or leave you with, are 3 thoughts about where we are and what we can do about it. So just 3 things to remember. If we want one internet, we've all got to think about one internet. It's not just you as an ISP, you as a content provider, you as a regulator, it's all of us together. It's consumers and providers. It's vendors as well. It's all of us together, because the common interest is actually about an internet for the future, and one that creates a single cohesive outcome. And that's not going to happen by accident or even by default. We're going to have to work at it. And secondly, if you have V4 addresses you're not using, sell them. Get rid of them. Stop hoarding them. Because addresses should be used in networks, not kept under the closet. Let them out, let them free, because hoarding makes the problem worse, not better. So if you've got spare addresses, get rid of them to someone who really needs them, and they need them today. The internet needs them today. So hoarding doesn't work. And lastly, let's make this thing happen quickly. Bring it on. Let's get rid of the last few V4 addresses all over the planet and start working on V6. Because the longer we make this transition, the harder it is to keep focus. I don't know about you, but I don't even remember what plans I had 5 years ago, let alone 10. And when I hear folks saying, oh, this transition will take 10 years or 20 years, I worry. It can't take that long. We'll lose focus. We will lose momentum. We need to get this thing done quickly. So bring it on. Let's make it happen. Because otherwise, we're going to some very dark places. I went to Iceland a couple of weeks ago to talk about V6. And the funny thing about Iceland is there are no trees. Same as on Easter Island, just out there to the east, a long way over. They chopped them all down. Why? It was a really dumb thing to do, because wood was the best thing they had. It keeps you warm, it builds boats. They chopped them all down. As humans, we're capable of doing some really stupid things to ourselves. And at this stage, with IPv6, we are capable of getting it completely wrong and destroying the very fabric of the internet. So unless we act together and unless we think about where we need to get to in the next few years, the opportunity is going to pass by. So I would urge you all, whether you're a consumer, an ISP or a vendor, to think seriously about IPv6 and think seriously about what you're doing next week, because otherwise you might join these guys building stone statues to the ghosts of trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff.